Straight to breaking news here in the UK because, let me tell you, a police officer has been cleared of murdering a man he shot in the head in South London 2 years ago. That has just come back, the jury just returning there in the last few moments. Chris Kaba, there he is, died during an armed police stop in Streatham back in September 2022. The Metropolitan Firearms Officer, Martyn Blake, had always denied any wrongdoing. He didn't show any emotion when the jury foreman announced the not guilty verdict. And Chris Kaba was soon to be a father and died from a single gunshot head wound. He was unarmed at the time. Before he was killed, his car was being followed because the vehicle had been linked to a shooting in Brixton the night before. Earlier in the trial, Martyn Blake had told the court, "I had a genuine belief that there was an imminent threat to life. If I hadn't acted, I thought one of my colleagues would have been dead." That is just detail coming from our correspondent who has been in court, Adina Campbell, and hopefully we'll talk to her in the next little while. But of course, the jury of 9 men and 3 women had been told by the prosecutor, Tom Little KC, that Blake had misjudged the risk to his colleagues and had aimed for Mr. Kaba's head when taking the fatal shot. The prosecution had claimed the officer exaggerated the threat in statements following the shooting, incorrectly stating that the Audi had been driving towards him and a colleague. Well, that is what the prosecution had said. And of course, we have just heard in the last little while that the jury coming back and bringing a not guilty verdict. Let me just repeat the headlines there, because that police officer has been cleared of murdering a man he shot in the head in South London 2 years ago. Chris Kaba dying there in that incident in Streatham in September 2022. Well, those were the basic details from Adina Campbell. She's our correspondent at the Old Bailey. Let's go to her. And Adina, tell us more.
Yes, well, in the last few minutes, the Metropolitan Firearms Officer Martyn Blake has been cleared of murdering Chris Kaba. He was shot on September the 5th, 2 years ago. This all happened because of a police chase that night. The car he was driving had been linked to a shooting the previous night, and moments after that, he was boxed in by police on a residential road in Streatham in South London. And within the space of 15 seconds, once he was surrounded by police cars, he was then shot by Martyn Blake. But in the last few minutes, Martyn Blake has been cleared of murdering Chris Kaba. Chris Kaba died of a single gunshot head injury. He died in hospital the following day. And this has been a very high-profile case. Martyn Blake had always denied any wrongdoing while giving his evidence in court across 2 days. Earlier in the trial, he said that he had a genuine belief that one of his colleagues could have been killed on the night Chris Kaba was shot. The jury here was shown plenty of dash cam and body cam footage of the moment just before he was killed. We saw various angles. It was a very dramatic, fast-moving situation. Officers hadn't expected Chris Kaba to move the vehicle once they had approached him to ask him to stop. But in that body cam footage, you could see Chris Kaba's car erratically being driven backwards and forwards. And it was in the space of about 15 seconds from the moment Chris Kaba's car was surrounded to when the shot was fired that this all unfolded. Chris Kaba was taken to hospital the next day following him being shot, and it was in the early hours of the following day when he was declared dead. Now, Chris Kaba's family have been in court ever since the beginning of this trial, which is now into its 3rd week. We know that Martyn Blake, he's a 40-year-old Metropolitan Police firearms officer. He gave evidence along with many other of his colleagues who gave their testimony anonymously behind a screen. And we heard from lots of other witnesses as well, forensic experts, pathologists. This has been a very high interest case, lots of people giving evidence, but today police officer, firearms officer, 40-year-old Martyn Blake has been cleared of murdering Chris Kaba.
Adina, In terms of what happened in the court, you mentioned that Chris Kaba's family was there in the court. Was there any reaction from Mr. Blake when the verdict actually was delivered?
Well, in court it was quiet. Chris Kaba's family were holding hands in solidarity in the moments before the verdict was announced, and there was no reaction from them in court. Martyn Blake, who was standing in the dock, he didn't show any emotion. It was a very quiet courtroom at that point. And of course, Martyn Blake now, he has been cleared of murdering Chris Kaba. It's of course a difficult day for the Kaba family who've been here over the last 3 weeks. And just to remind you of the case, this happened 2 years ago. Chris Kaba was shot 2 years ago. And here's a reminder of what happened on the night Chris Kaba was killed. The final moments of Chris Kaba's life caught on firearms officer Martyn Blake's body-worn camera. They weren't expecting him to try and escape, and that's when the fatal shot is fired. The bullet has pierced through the car windscreen into Chris Kaba's forehead. Despite officers giving him CPR and the arrival of paramedics, the 24-year-old dies in hospital the following day. Speaking to BBC Panorama, his mum says as a boy, he always wanted to cheer people up.
He don't want to see people to be sad. So he needs to find some way to make people laugh, to make people to be happy. That's his Chris.
Chris Kaba was unarmed on the night he was killed and soon to be a father. But the car he was driving had been linked to a shooting in Brixton the previous night, and that's why police had been following him before he was stopped.
When you think about the powers that we give to the police, we trust them to use force. They are able to carry lethal weapons. We trust that they will use their discretion to determine whether or not somebody looks suspicious, for example, and that opens a plethora of ability for them to be able to harm people in the name of justice. And so, of course, we should hold them to a higher standard than the average person when it comes to looking at those uses of power.
While giving his evidence, Metropolitan Police firearms officer Martyn Blake told the jury he had a genuine belief that one of his colleagues could be killed if he hadn't have used his gun. He also told the court he did not intend to kill Chris Kaba, and it was the high revving and sudden movement of the car that led to him firing the shots. More than 100 officers handed back their permits, allowing them to carry weapons, when Martyn Blake was charged with murder a year later. A former firearms commander says officers who carry guns aren't paid more for taking on these duties and are highly trained to meet the demands of the job, which are often dangerous and unpredictable.
It's entirely voluntary. You cannot, under any circumstances, a chief constable, chief officer, cannot force anybody to carry a firearm. Firearms training and the actual carrying of a firearm is a huge decision for any officer to make because, of course, the thing is they are a lethal weapon. But the major factor for any firearms officer is the safety of the public.
Nobody has the power to take someone's life. No one.
Adina Campbell, BBC News.